The year was 1883, and the harsh winds of the Wyoming Territory carried more than just dust and tumbleweeds across the endless plains. They carried the dreams of desperate men, the echoes of broken promises, and for one particular cowboy named Ezekiel, Zeke Morrison, they carried the weight of a solitude so profound it had become his only constant companion. Zeke Morrison was 34 years old, though the relentless sun and bitter winters had carved lines into his weathered face that made him appear a decade older. His steel-grey eyes, once bright with the optimism of youth, now reflected the empty vastness of the landscape he called home. He stood 6 feet tall with broad shoulders that had grown accustomed to carrying burdens both physical and emotional, and his calloused hands told the story of a man who had worked every day of his adult life just to survive another sunset. 3 years earlier, Zeke had owned a modest but thriving ranch on the outskirts of Cheyenne, complete with a 2-bedroom cabin, a sturdy barn, and nearly 200 head of cattle. He had been engaged to marry Sarah Beth Williams, the schoolteacher's daughter, and had dreams of building a family legacy that would span generations. But in the span of 6 devastating months, everything he had worked for had crumbled like a house of cards in a prairie storm. First came the drought of 1880, which lasted 8 months and turned his green pastures into cracked, barren earth. His cattle began dying one by one, their carcasses dotting his land like grim monuments to his failing fortune. Then came the blizzard of February 1881, which killed most of his remaining livestock and destroyed his barn. When the bank came calling for loan payments he could no longer make, Zeke was forced to sell his land for a fraction of what it was worth, just to avoid complete financial ruin. Sarah Beth, faced with the prospect of marrying a man with no prospects and no future, had quietly broken their engagement and married the banker's son instead. Zeke had watched from across the street as she walked out of the church in her white wedding dress, her arm linked with a man who could offer her the security and stability that Zeke no longer could. That night, he had packed his few remaining possessions and left Cheyenne forever, determined never to look back at the life he had lost. For 3 years now, Zeke had wandered the territories as a drifter, taking temporary work wherever he could find it. He had herded cattle for big ranches in Montana, worked silver mines in Colorado, and even spent a winter as a hunting guide for wealthy Eastern tourists who wanted to experience the authentic Wild West. But no matter where he went or what work he found, the jobs were always temporary, and he always found himself moving on when the seasons changed. His only constant companion during these lonely years was Thunder, a magnificent black stallion with a white blaze on his forehead and 4 white socks. Thunder had been a wedding gift from Sarah Beth's father, intended as a symbol of the prosperity and happiness that awaited Zeke in his married life. When everything else was lost, Zeke couldn't bring himself to sell Thunder. The horse had become more than just transportation. He was the last tangible connection to the man Zeke used to be, the man who had once believed in tomorrow. Thunder was no ordinary horse. He possessed an intelligence and loyalty that seemed almost supernatural, and over the years of wandering together, Zeke had come to believe that the stallion understood his pain in ways that no human ever could. When Zeke talked to Thunder during the long, lonely nights around their campfire, he swore the horse listened with genuine comprehension. When storms approached, Thunder would grow restless hours before the first clouds appeared on the horizon. When danger lurked nearby, whether in the form of hostile animals or dangerous men, Thunder's ears would prick up and his muscles would tense, alerting Zeke to threats he might otherwise have missed. On this particular October morning in 1883, Zeke and Thunder were traveling along a rarely used trail that cut through the Badlands between Wyoming and Colorado. Zeke had heard rumors of a mining operation near Denver that was hiring experienced workers, and though he had little enthusiasm for descending into dark tunnels every day, he needed work badly enough to investigate any opportunity. His money was running dangerously low, and winter was approaching fast. The landscape around them was harsh and unforgiving, characterized by rocky outcroppings, sparse vegetation, and a sun that seemed to beat down with malicious intensity despite the advancing season. They had been riding since dawn, and both man and horse were feeling the effects of the heat and the challenging terrain. Zeke's water supply was running low, and he knew they would need to find a stream or settlement soon. It was just past noon when they crested a small hill and saw something that made Zeke pull Thunder to a sudden stop. In the shallow valley below, near a cluster of stunted cottonwood trees that indicated the presence of water, a covered wagon sat motionless in the blazing sun. Even from a distance, Zeke could see that something was wrong. The wagon's canvas top was torn and flapping in the wind, one of its wheels was broken, and there was no sign of the horses that should have been pulling it. As they rode closer, Zeke could make out the figure of a woman sitting in the shade of the largest cottonwood tree. She appeared to be alone, and her posture suggested exhaustion or despair. Beside her sat two small children, a boy and a girl, who couldn't have been more than 6 or 7 years old. Their clothes were dusty and travel-worn, and even from a distance, Zeke could sense their vulnerability. Thunder snorted and tossed his head as they approached, his keen senses picking up something that made him nervous. Zeke patted the horse's neck reassuringly, but he shared Thunder's unease. In this lawless territory, a lone traveler had to be cautious about approaching strangers, especially when they appeared to be in distress. Too often, apparent victims turned out to be bait for elaborate ambushes designed to rob or kill unwary Good Samaritans. But as they drew nearer, Zeke's natural compassion overcame his caution. The woman was clearly in genuine distress, and the children were obviously real, not actors in some elaborate deception. The woman appeared to be in her late 20s, with auburn hair that had escaped from its pins and now hung in dusty tangles around her shoulders. Her dress, once a respectable blue calico, was now stained with sweat and dirt, and her face was flushed from the heat and marked with tear tracks. When she heard Thunder's hoofbeats, the woman looked up with a mixture of hope and fear in her green eyes. She stood slowly, swaying slightly from what appeared to be dehydration or exhaustion, and moved protectively in front of the two children. "Please," she called out when Zeke was close enough to hear her voice, "we need help. Our horses ran off during a storm last night, and our wagon is broken. We have no water left." Zeke dismounted and approached slowly, his hands visible and his manner as non-threatening as possible. Up close, he could see that the woman and children were indeed in desperate straits. Their lips were cracked from dehydration, their eyes were sunken, and they had the hollow, desperate look of people who had been pushed to their absolute limits. "Ma'am," Zeke said, touching the brim of his hat politely, "I'm Ezekiel Morrison. What's your situation here?" The woman's relief at encountering another human being was palpable. "My name is Catherine Wells," she said, her voice hoarse from thirst. "These are my children, Emma and Samuel. We were traveling to Colorado to join my husband, who's working in the silver mines near Leadville. Our wagon broke down yesterday evening, and during the storm last night, our horses broke free and ran off. We've been here since dawn, hoping someone would come along this trail." Zeke examined the broken wagon wheel and quickly determined that it was beyond any field repair he could manage. The axle had cracked, and one of the spokes had snapped completely. Even with proper tools and materials, it would take a skilled wheelwright to make the repairs necessary to get the wagon moving again. "How much water do you have left?" he asked. "None," Catherine admitted, her voice breaking slightly. "We drank the last of it this morning. I know this trail isn't used very often, and I was starting to fear Tuppa." She trailed off, unwilling to voice her growing certainty that they might die in this desolate place. Zeke looked at the two children, who were watching him with the wide, trusting eyes that only children possess. Little Emma, who couldn't have been more than 5 years old, had blonde hair like her mother's and was clutching a small, raggedy doll. Samuel, perhaps a year or two older, was trying to be brave, but Zeke could see the fear beneath his serious expression. The nearest town was Bitter Creek, a small settlement about 30 miles to the southeast. It was a hard day's ride on a good horse, but for a woman and 2 small children on foot, it might as well have been on the moon. Even if they had water, the journey would be nearly impossible. Without water, it would be a death sentence. Zeke's own water supply was limited. He had perhaps 2 days' worth for himself, and maybe 1 day's worth if he shared it with the family. But that still wouldn't be enough to get them all to safety. The logical thing to do would be to give them what water he could spare, then ride hard to Bitter Creek to bring back help. But that would mean leaving them alone for at least 2 days, possibly 3, and he wasn't sure they could survive that long in the brutal heat. As he pondered their dire situation, Thunder nickered softly and nuzzled Zeke's shoulder, as if sensing his master's internal struggle. Zeke absently stroked the horse's nose while his mind raced through the limited options available to them. "Ma'am," he said finally, "I need to be honest with you about your situation. It's not good. The nearest settlement is a day's hard ride from here, and there's no way you and the children could make that journey on foot, especially without water." Catherine's face paled, but she nodded bravely. "What do you suggest?" "I could take one of you on my horse and ride for help," Zeke offered, though even as he said it, he knew it wasn't a real solution. "But that would mean leaving two of you here alone, and I can't guarantee how long it would take to get back with assistance." "I couldn't leave my children," Catherine said immediately, "and I couldn't ask you to take them and leave me here alone." Zeke looked at Thunder, who was standing patiently in the blazing sun, occasionally stamping a hoof or swishing his tail at flies. The stallion was strong and healthy, capable of carrying 2 riders if necessary, but even that wouldn't solve their fundamental problem. 3 people couldn't ride one horse 30 miles across rough terrain, especially when 2 of them were small children. It was then that an idea began to form in Zeke's mind, an idea so radical and devastating that he almost dismissed it immediately. But as he looked at the desperate family and thought about their limited options, he realized it might be their only chance for survival. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "there is one possibility, but it would require a significant sacrifice on my part, and I need to think about it carefully." "What kind of sacrifice?" Catherine asked, though there was already a glimmer of hope in her eyes. Zeke took a deep breath, hardly believing he was about to voice the thought that had occurred to him. "I could give you my horse. Thunder is strong and intelligent, and he knows the way to Bitter Creek. He could carry you and both children to safety." Catherine stared at him in shock. "I couldn't possibly accept such a gift. Your horse must be worth a fortune, and besides, what would happen to you?" "I'd walk," Zeke said simply. "It would take me 3 or 4 days to reach civilization on foot, but I have enough water for that if I'm careful. You and the children need to get out of here immediately, and Thunder is the only way that's going to happen." "But sir, you don't understand. I couldn't repay you for such a valuable animal. We're traveling to meet my husband because we lost our farm in Kansas. We have almost no money." Zeke looked at Thunder again, remembering the day Sarah Beth's father had presented the young stallion to him as an engagement gift. He thought about all the miles they had traveled together, all the lonely nights when Thunder's presence had been his only comfort, all the dangers they had faced side by side. The idea of giving up his only friend and companion was almost unbearable. But then he looked at little Emma, who was beginning to sway on her feet from dehydration, and at Samuel, who was trying so hard to be brave despite his obvious fear. He thought about Catherine, a mother desperate to protect her children and reunite with her husband. He thought about what it would mean if these 3 innocent people died in this desolate place because he wasn't willing to make a sacrifice. "Ma'am," Zeke said, his voice firm despite the pain in his heart, "some things are more important than money. Thunder has been my partner for years, and if he can save your family, then that's the most worthy purpose he could serve." "I don't know what to say," Catherine whispered, tears beginning to flow down her dusty cheeks. "Such kindness from a stranger. It's more than we deserve." "Everyone deserves kindness," Zeke replied, "especially children." Over the next hour, Zeke prepared Thunder for the journey to Bitter Creek. He showed Catherine how to mount the stallion and how to position the children safely in front of and behind her. Thunder, as if sensing the importance of his mission, stood perfectly still during these preparations, his usual spirited energy replaced by a calm intelligence that seemed almost human. Zeke gave Catherine his last canteen of water and most of his remaining food, keeping only enough for his own long walk to safety. He drew a rough map in the dirt, showing her the landmarks she should watch for and the route Thunder would instinctively follow. He explained how the horse would need to rest periodically and how to find water along the way. "Thunder will take care of you," he assured her. "He's the smartest horse I've ever known, and he has an instinct for finding water and avoiding danger. Trust him completely." As Catherine prepared to depart with the children, she turned to Zeke with tears in her eyes. "How can I ever repay you for this? How can I ever thank you for sacrificing so much for strangers? Just get to safety," Zeke said. "When you reach your husband, tell him there are still good people in this world. That's all the thanks I need." Little Emma suddenly spoke up, her small voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Mister, will your horse be okay with us? He looks sad to leave you." Zeke knelt down so he was at eye level with the little girl. "Thunder is going to take very good care of you and your mama and your brother. He's the bravest, strongest horse in the whole world, and he knows how important his job is." Samuel, the older child, looked at Zeke with the serious expression that sometimes appears on children who have been forced to grow up too quickly. "Are you going to be okay, walking all that way by yourself?" "I'll be fine," Zeke assured him. "I'm used to being on my own, and I know how to take care of myself in the wilderness. You just worry about taking care of your mama and your sister." As Catherine mounted Thunder with Emma in front of her and Samuel behind, Zeke felt his heart breaking in a way he hadn't experienced since he lost everything 3 years earlier. But this was a different kind of pain. This wasn't the bitter anguish of loss and defeat. This was the bittersweet ache that comes from choosing to do something right, even when it costs everything. Thunder turned his great head to look at Zeke one last time, and for a moment, man and horse shared a communication that transcended words. In the stallion's dark eyes, Zeke saw understanding, acceptance, and something that might have been gratitude for the years they had shared together. "Take care of them, boy," Zeke whispered, stroking Thunder's neck one final time. "Take care of them like you've always taken care of me." Then Catherine urged Thunder forward, and Zeke watched as his only friend in the world carried 3 strangers toward safety, leaving him alone in the vast wilderness with nothing but the clothes on his back, a nearly empty water bottle, and a heart that felt both broken and strangely full at the same time. For the rest of that day, Zeke walked southward toward Bitter Creek, following game trails and dry creek beds that offered the easiest passage through the rugged terrain. The sun beat down mercilessly, and every step was a reminder of how much his life had changed in the span of a few hours. But despite his physical discomfort and the grief of losing Thunder, Zeke found himself thinking about Catherine and the children, hoping they were making good progress, and that Thunder was taking care of them as he always had. That night, Zeke made camp in a shallow depression that offered some protection from the wind. Without Thunder's warmth and companionship, the darkness seemed more complete than ever before. He had grown accustomed to talking to the horse during the long, lonely evenings, sharing his thoughts and fears with an audience that never judged or criticized. Now, sitting alone by his small fire, the silence was almost overwhelming. As he tried to fall asleep on the hard ground, using his saddle as a pillow, Zeke wondered if he had made the right decision. Thunder had been worth at least $200, probably more, and losing him meant that Zeke was now truly destitute. He had no horse, almost no money, and no prospects for employment in the immediate future. The generous act that had saved 3 lives might well have doomed his own. But when these doubts crept into his mind, Zeke forced himself to remember little Emma's trusting eyes and Samuel's brave attempt to comfort his mother. He thought about Catherine's desperate gratitude and her determination to protect her children at any cost. Whatever hardships lay ahead for him, he knew he had done the right thing. The second day of walking was worse than the first. Zeke's water was running low, and the heat seemed even more intense than before. His boots, designed for riding rather than walking, were giving him blisters, and every muscle in his body ached from the unaccustomed exercise. But he pressed on, driven by the knowledge that stopping meant death in this unforgiving landscape. It was late on the 3rd day when Zeke finally saw the smoke from cooking fires that indicated he was approaching Bitter Creek. The small settlement consisted of perhaps 20 buildings clustered around a crossroads, with a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith shop, and a few other businesses that served the scattered ranches and mining operations in the area. Zeke's first stop was the saloon, where he used his last few coins to buy a beer and gather information about whether Catherine and the children had made it to safety. The bartender, a grizzled man named Pete, who seemed to know everyone's business in the territory, confirmed that a woman with 2 children riding a black stallion had passed through 2 days earlier. "Headed toward Colorado Springs," Pete reported. "Said she was going to catch the train to Leadville to meet her husband. Seemed real grateful to whoever had helped her out of a tight spot. She was asking around town if anyone knew a cowboy named Morrison. Said she wanted to send him some money when she got settled." Relief flooded through Zeke's exhausted body. Catherine and the children had made it to safety, which meant Thunder had done his job perfectly. The knowledge that his sacrifice had succeeded made every painful step of his 3-day journey worthwhile. Over the next several days, Zeke recovered his strength while working odd jobs around Bitter Creek to earn enough money for food and lodging. He helped the blacksmith shoe horses, assisted the general store owner with inventory, and even spent a day helping to repair the roof on the town's small church. The work was menial, and the pay was minimal, but it was enough to keep him alive while he figured out his next move. It was during this time that Zeke began to notice something unusual happening in the hills around Bitter Creek. Local ranchers were reporting sightings of large herds of wild Mustangs, more than had been seen in the area for years. The horses seemed to be moving in a deliberate pattern, as if they were searching for something or someone. Old Jake Murphy, who ran a small ranch north of town, mentioned the phenomenon during one of his visits to the general store. "Strangest thing I ever seen," he told anyone who would listen. "Must be 300 head of wild horses out there, maybe more. They've been circling around the territory for days now, like they're looking for something. My boys tried to get close enough to maybe catch a few, but them Mustangs are too smart and too fast. They always stay just out of reach." Zeke listened to these reports with growing curiosity, but he didn't make any connection to his own situation until the morning he decided to walk out to the hills north of town to look for work at some of the outlying ranches. He had been walking for perhaps an hour when he crested a small ridge and saw something that made him stop dead in his tracks. Below him, in a natural amphitheater formed by rolling hills, hundreds of wild Mustangs grazed peacefully in the morning sun. There were horses of every color and size, from small quick mares to massive stallions with flowing manes. But what caught Zeke's attention wasn't the sheer number of animals. It was the magnificent black stallion with a white blaze and 4 white socks who stood at the edge of the herd, his head raised and his ears pricked forward as if he were listening for something. "Thunder?" Zeke whispered, hardly daring to believe what he was seeing. At the sound of his voice, the black stallion's head turned sharply in his direction. Even at a distance of several hundred yards, there was no mistaking the intelligence and recognition in those dark eyes. Thunder whinnied loudly, a sound of pure joy that echoed across the hills, and began galloping toward his former master. The reunion between man and horse was emotional beyond anything Zeke could have imagined. Thunder pranced and nickered with excitement, nuzzling Zeke's face and hands, as if to confirm that his old friend was real and unharmed. Zeke buried his face in the stallion's neck, overwhelmed by relief and gratitude at having his companion back. But Thunder wasn't alone. As Zeke looked up from embracing his horse, he saw that the entire herd of Mustangs was approaching, led by several magnificent stallions who seemed to regard Thunder as their leader. The wild horses surrounded Zeke and Thunder, snorting and stamping, but showing no signs of aggression. Instead, they seemed curious and almost respectful, as if Thunder had told them about the man who had sacrificed everything to save a family in need. Over the following days, the story of what had happened became clear through conversations with Catherine, who had returned to Bitter Creek specifically to find Zeke and express her gratitude. Thunder had indeed carried the family safely to civilization, displaying an intelligence and care that had amazed everyone who witnessed it. But after completing his mission, instead of staying in the town where he could have been comfortable and well-fed, Thunder had returned to the wilderness. "The stable owner in Colorado Springs said he'd never seen anything like it," Catherine explained to Zeke. "Thunder stayed just long enough to make sure we were safe, and had booked passage on the train to Leadville. Then, early the next morning, he broke out of the corral and headed back toward the wilderness. The stable owner said it was like the horse had urgent business elsewhere. What had happened next was unprecedented in the experience of anyone in the territory. Thunder had somehow gathered together wild Mustang herds from across hundreds of square miles, using some form of communication that humans couldn't understand. The combined herd had then traveled as a unit back to the area where Zeke was recovering, as if Thunder had organized a massive search and rescue operation. "It's like he went out and convinced all those wild horses to help him find you," said Dr. William Hartley, a traveling naturalist who had come to study the unusual Mustang behavior. "I've been studying animal behavior for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like this. It's as if your horse understood that you needed help and organized an entire equine army to provide it." The implications of Thunder's return with 300 wild Mustangs were staggering. In the 1880s, wild horses were valuable commodities. sought after by the military, ranchers, and anyone who needed strong, hardy animals. A skilled horsebreaker could make a good living capturing and training Mustangs, and someone who had access to a herd of this size could become wealthy almost overnight. But more than the potential financial benefits, the Mustangs represented something that Zeke had thought he'd lost forever: a future. For 3 years he had wandered aimlessly, taking temporary jobs and never planning beyond the next meal or the next night's shelter. The return of Thunder and the arrival of the Mustang herd offered him an opportunity to rebuild his life in a way he had never imagined possible. Local ranchers and businessmen, recognizing the opportunity that Zeke's unique situation presented, began approaching him with proposals. Jake Murphy offered to provide land and facilities for a horsebreaking operation in exchange for a percentage of the profits. The territorial government expressed interest in purchasing trained horses for the cavalry. Even the railroad companies sent representatives to discuss the possibility of contracting for work animals. But Zeke found himself reluctant to simply capture and sell the Mustangs that had come to him in such an extraordinary way. These weren't just wild animals to be exploited for profit. They were Thunder's friends and allies, creatures who had participated in what could only be described as an act of loyalty and gratitude. The idea of breaking them to the saddle and selling them to the highest bidder felt like a betrayal of the trust they had shown. Instead, Zeke developed a different approach. Working with Thunder as an intermediary, he began to establish relationships with individual horses in the herd, learning their personalities and temperaments. Rather than breaking their spirits through force and confinement, he used patience and respect to gain their trust. The process took longer than traditional horsebreaking methods, but the results were remarkable. The horses that Zeke trained retained their intelligence and independence while becoming reliable partners for their human owners. Word of his unique methods spread throughout the territory, and soon he had more requests for trained horses than he could possibly fulfill. Unlike the broken, spiritless animals produced by conventional training, Zeke's horses were known for their loyalty, intelligence, and willingness to work with their riders rather than simply submit to them. Within 6 months, Zeke had established the most successful horse training operation in the territory. He purchased land from Jake Murphy and built facilities that allowed the Mustangs to live in conditions as close to their natural state as possible, while still providing the structure necessary for training. The operation employed 12 men and had a waiting list of customers that stretched for months. But the financial success, gratifying as it was, paled in comparison to the personal transformation that Zeke experienced. For the first time since losing his ranch and his fiancée, he felt that his life had purpose and meaning. He was no longer a drifter existing from day to day. He was a man building something lasting and valuable. The relationship between Zeke and Thunder also evolved during this period. The stallion seemed to understand that he was now more than just Zeke's mount. He was a partner in a larger enterprise. Thunder took an active role in working with the other horses, often serving as a mediator when conflicts arose within the herd or when new horses needed to be integrated into the group. Catherine Wells, now reunited with her husband in Leadville, kept in touch with Zeke through regular letters. Her husband had struck it rich in the silver mines, and the family's fortunes had improved dramatically. But Catherine never forgot the debt she owed to the lonely cowboy who had sacrificed his most precious possession to save her family. "Your kindness changed our lives," she wrote in one letter, "but I think it may have changed yours even more. Sometimes the greatest gifts we receive come from the gifts we give to others." A year after the encounter in the Badlands, Zeke received an unexpected visitor. Sarah Beth Williams, now Sarah Beth Patterson, arrived in Bitter Creek with her husband, who was investigating investment opportunities in the booming horse trade. She had heard about Zeke's success and wanted to see for herself what had become of the man she had once planned to marry. The meeting was awkward, but not unpleasant. Sarah Beth was still beautiful, still possessed of the refined manners that had once attracted Zeke, but he found that the sight of her no longer caused him pain. The bitterness and resentment he had carried for so long had been replaced by something that might have been pity for what she had chosen over what she had given up. "You seem happy," she observed as they walked through his facilities, watching him work with a particularly spirited Mustang mare. "I am happy," Zeke replied, realizing as he said it that it was true. "I'm doing work that matters with animals I respect in a place I've chosen to be. What more could a man ask for? "Don't you ever think about what might have been?" Sarah Beth asked. "About the life we had planned together?" Zeke considered the question seriously before answering. "I think about it sometimes, but not with regret. That life belonged to a different man, a man who thought happiness came from having things rather than doing things. I'm not that man anymore." Sarah Beth's husband, who had been observing the horse training operation with obvious interest, made Zeke an offer to expand his business with Eastern financial backing. It was a generous proposal that would have made Zeke wealthy beyond his wildest dreams, but it would also have required him to adopt industrial methods that treated horses as commodities rather than individuals. "I appreciate the offer," Zeke told him, "but this operation works precisely because it's small enough for me to know every horse personally. Thunder and I didn't build this to get rich. We built it to prove that there's a better way to work with these animals." 3 years after giving Thunder to a desperate family, Zeke Morrison had become one of the most respected horsemen in the territory. His methods were studied by ranchers and military officers throughout the West, and his trained horses were prized from California to Texas. But more importantly, he had found peace with himself and his place in the world. On quiet evenings, when the work was done and the Mustangs grazed peacefully in their pastures, Zeke would sit on the porch of his modest cabin with Thunder standing nearby, and he would think about the chain of events that had brought them to this point. A moment of compassion for strangers in desperate need had cost him his most precious possession, but had ultimately returned to him everything he had lost and more. The wild Mustangs that had followed Thunder home had not just provided Zeke with a livelihood, they had given him a purpose that went beyond mere survival. Every horse he trained, every partnership he helped forge between human and animal, was a testament to the power of sacrifice and the unexpected rewards that sometimes follow acts of selfless kindness. And sometimes, when the wind was just right and the evening light painted the hills in shades of gold, Zeke could almost hear the voices of Catherine and her children, carried across the years and the miles, still saying thank you to the lonely cowboy who had given his last horse to strangers, and found in return that he was no longer lonely at all.